affair. I could add that to the story next time I tell it, although it's also not funny, especially to my parents. Divinity school wasn't a joke to them. They entered as two separate people, both in their 30s, confused and lonely and searching for some kind of salvation. But they wanted to find it the hard way. They met in an Old Testament class taught by an older professor named Dr. Holliday. I called him Doc Holliday, like the cowboy, with whom they would eventually end up living when I was a baby, when they had no home to call their own and zero support from their families. My father's having none to give, and my mother's so disapproving that they chose to withhold it all. I believe it was my mother's only affair. I know it wasn't my father's. They would tell their spouses they were going on spiritual retreats, then abscond to the White Mountains in New Hampshire to spend time with one another, camping to save money. My mother would eventually break it off. She had a son and a husband with a good job and a house, a family, the beginnings of a life. This was just a panic fling, she told herself. One final push against the life that was expected of her before she settled down. My father, not new to this game, talked my mother into one last trip to the mountains. In what can only be described as the dictionary definition of TMI, I know that both my parents were using birth control during this trip, and that despite their precautionary measures, I was conceived on top of a mountain, Mount Kerrigan. I know this because my mother told me. Telling a child at a very young age, whom you're raising in the Catholic Church, that he was a miracle conception is a choice. Messy parenting, maybe, but it makes for another good story. My mother debated telling her husband that I was his. She didn't know what to do. She and my father had broken up, after all, and he was predominantly out of the picture. On the cover of my baby book, the name William Isaac Helen is lovingly embroidered in red cloth letters onto dark blue patterned fabric. The first name for my father, the middle name for me, and the last my mother's maiden name. My whole life has been spent with teachers and officials asking, William, do you prefer Bill or Will or Isaac? I'd respond to their surprise, and then add breezily, my mother didn't understand first names. Eventually, my father came back on the scene, his wife having grown wary of his infidelities. After a year living with the kindly Dr. Holliday in his cramped apartment, our little trio finally landed at the Catholic Worker, a socialist Catholic charity that housed the homeless and fed the hungry. Soon my parents were a part of their community, and so was I. We were living in the south end of Boston, first on Dartmouth Street when I was a baby, then on Tremont Street as a toddler, and finally at John Larry House, a low-income apartment building run by the Catholic Worker on Massachusetts Avenue. It was called Mass Ave for short, and as a child, I used to think our street was named after a church service, not the state we lived in. I loved those early years. I loved growing up in Boston. My father would go running along the Charles River as I biked beside him, pumping my little legs in an attempt to keep up. Or he'd take me to Fenway Park. This was the 80s, before the Sox were a winning team and before Fenway was almost constantly sold out. My dad would buy standing room tickets, the cheapest you could get. Come the second or third inning, he'd have us in seats down by the field, so close you could smell the grass. Sometimes the seats belonged to season ticket holders who hadn't shown up. Sometimes they were just empty. But if the ticket holders ever did arrive, or security got curious, my pa would turn and say, "Oh, I'm very sorry. It's just that the seats were open and, well, it's my son's first game." We almost always got to stay in our seats, or would sometimes be ushered to even better ones. I must have had 100 first games. I loved hanging out in the soup kitchen, too. Haley House. I was surrounded by all sorts of people there, people just like me, or people not like me, from various walks of life. But because we were at the soup kitchen together, we were like each other. We shared something important: community. I was surrounded by stories of the highest comedy and the deepest tragedy, by the sounds of pealing laughter and suffering silence. I didn't know my experience was any different from the way other children grew up. I was poor, but cared for. Back then, my parents were good to each other.